Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second lecture of Ancient Greek Medicine and Psychology. Today, we're going to look at some of the earliest Greek philosophical theories. There's going to be a lot of material to cover today, but it's really cool stuff, and I'm very excited to talk about it. Okay, so one of the important things to know about early Greek philosophers is that they were a heterogeneous group. So they weren't a single school of philosophy that had a single set of views. They were different philosophers that had very different philosophical systems that they defended. So one thing that made them diverse is that they were from all over the Greek world. So, for example, Democritus, who we read for this week, was from Abdera. Heraclitus was from Ephesus. There were philosophers from Athens. There were also philosophers from Italy, which would be off the map to the west here. So they came from all over the place. They were also chronologically diverse in the sense that they spanned about a 200-year period from roughly 600 BCE to 400 BCE. So if you remember last week, Homer and Hesiod lived sometime around this period. So the early Greek philosophers are after the readings that we did last week. Thales is traditionally considered to be the first Greek philosopher. He was born around 420. And another thing to note is that often the early Greek philosophers are collectively called pre-Socratic philosophers. I might sometimes slip into that usage, but it's not my preferred term because it's a little bit misleading, because pre-Socratic implies, of course, before Socrates. But Socrates himself was born in 469 BCE and lived until 399. So he actually overlapped with a lot of the thinkers that we're reading for this week. But I point that out just because it is a very common usage. Okay, so although the early Greek philosophers were a very diverse group, there were things that they tended to have in common. So let me list a few of those things now. The first had to do with their focus. They tended to emphasize trying to explain meteorological, cosmological, and biological phenomena. So what goes on in the heavens, what stars are made of, why the sun sets and rises. They wanted to know about weather phenomena, rainstorms, lightning, thunder, earthquakes, and also biological phenomena, as we'll see later. The nature of the animal kingdom, of life itself, and physiological processes and psychological processes. So, in other words, they tended to focus on topics that in today's world fall under the purview of the sciences. Another thing they had in common is that there was a trend toward more naturalistic ways of explaining things, and also, relatedly, a reliance on observation. So this represents, to some extent, a contrast with what we saw in Homer and Hesiod. So remember that when somebody like Homer, or the early Greeks whose views they reflect, wanted to explain something like lightning or thunder, they attribute that to a supernatural explanation. You know, when there's thunder or lightning, it's because Zeus, the god, is hurling thunderbolts. And in attributing thunder and lightning to causes like that, they're attributing them to unobservable causes. So, in other words, it's not that Homer or early Greeks literally saw Zeus or could perceive Zeus throwing thunderbolts. Rather, there was an observable phenomenon that they wanted to be able to explain, and so they gave it a mythical, supernatural explanation that appealed to the unobservable divine. By contrast, the early Greek philosophers that we're looking at today tended to give naturalistic explanation in terms of the things that they could see around them in the natural world. In doing so, they often also tend to make use of analogy between the microcosmic level and the macrocosmic level. So in other words, they'll take everyday, more mundane things that they can see and understand in front of them in the world, and they'll use those explanations and apply them to broader phenomena related to the nature of the universe as a whole. So I think the best way to illustrate some of these points is to go through some examples. So here is a view of Thales. Some say the Earth rests on water. Thales held that it stayed where it was because it was buoyant, like wood or something like that, for none of these things naturally stays in air, but in water. So recall that one of the last week we talked about how one of the things that puzzled Greeks was why it doesn't feel like the Earth and us on the Earth are falling when Earth and rocks tend to fall if you drop them. What keeps us stable in the universe, or at least what they believed to be stable in the universe? And we saw that last week the explanation mythologically was that a god, Atlas, is literally holding the Earth on his shoulders and supporting us in that way. By contrast, Thales here is appealing to a naturalistic explanation. So he notes that, yes, Earth, if you drop a clump of Earth through the air, it will fall. However, if you take certain kinds of Earth, at least, like wood, as in the case of a ship, and put it on water, it will stay put. So whereas wood, which is, again, a kind of earth stuff for the Greeks, whereas it will fall if you drop a log through the air, it will float if you put it on water. So, he reasoned, the earth itself is kind of like a log and it stays put because it's on water, supported by water, not air. So what you have is a natural explanation that appeals to an analogy between something evident and visible that they can see in the everyday world, logs floating in the water, ships floating on the water, and applies it to the nature of the cosmos. Here we have an explanation of the phenomenon of thunder from the early philosopher Anaximenes. So, some believe that a fiery wind traveling through humid and moist regions makes a sound, for not even glowing iron can be moistened quietly, but if the red-hot ore is dipped in water, it is quenched with a loud hiss. Thus, Anaximenes says, a wind falling on clouds emits thunder, and while it struggles to make its way through tears in the opposing matter, its very escape causes it to ignite in fire. So here we're explaining thunder and lightning, and the idea is that, if you take a red-hot piece of iron or metal and you dip it in water, it makes that, sizzling, hissing sound. So he reasons that similarly, the reason that we hear thunder is that hot, fiery winds are breaking through humid, moist cloud and air, and it's that ripping through them or passing through them that causes, similarly, its sort of loud sizzle or hiss that we recognize as thunder. So again, you have the case of taking something that is observable in their everyday life for the Greeks, something hot sizzling in water, and applying that to the nature of a weather event. The gods also gave more naturalistic explanations of the gods themselves. So one thing to note is that the early Greek philosophers were not, as a general rule, atheistic. They did believe in gods or the divine, but they tended to view the divine very differently from what we saw them portrayed as in Greek and how they were portrayed standardly in Greek religion. So here, Xenophanes writes, if cattle, horses, or lions had hands and were able to draw with their hands, horses would make the forms of gods similar to horses and cattle similar to cattle, drawing their bodies just like their own bodies. So what we see here is Xenophanes challenging the anthropomorphic conception of the gods. As we've seen before, the Greeks think of the gods as being in form like human beings. They look like us and have bodies like ours and act like us. So, here, for example, is an ancient Greek depiction of the goddess Athena, and you can see she looks like just basically an ordinary human woman. What Xenophanes is sort of highlighting is the egotism of that view and sort of the arbitrariness of it. And he's suggesting that, in fact, we have no reason to believe that the gods actually look like us and that the nature of the divine happens to look just like our bodies, by drawing attention to this sort of hypothetical of what other animals would make their gods look like if they could draw. Okay, so One of the main things that the early Greek philosophers wanted to explain was the nature of the world around us. So they had lots of questions about the natural world and the existence of the universe as a whole. So, first of all, where does the world, meaning the universe, the cosmos, come from, and what is it made of? And secondly, where do all the specific things that exist in the world come from, and how do we explain their existence? So, on the one hand, what they wanted to know was, why, how did the whole universe, everything that there is, come into existence? How did the cosmos as a whole come into existence? What is it made of? But also, then more specifically, how do all of the little individual things in the universe exist and why and what are they made of? So, things like rocks and trees and people, for example. And the answers that they gave, again, tended to appeal to observable elements in the natural world. So let's look at some examples again. So that which all existing things are made of and from which they come to be, this, the first philosophers say, is the building block and the principle, arche, of existing things. Thales says the principle is water, getting this conception from observing that everything derives its nourishment from what is moist, and from the fact that the seeds of all things have a moist nature, and also the fact that water is the source of growth for moist things. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this passage. First, let me say a little bit about the word arche. I mentioned this in the notes on the reading, but I want to just reiterate it because it's a really important concept here. For the Greeks, the term arche means literally beginning or starting point. And so when the Greeks are investigating what the arche of something is, or the arche of the cosmos, what they're looking for is where did the cosmos come from? What was it built out of? What was its building block? What is its origin? What is its source? What is it composed of? What is it made of? All of those questions are sort of bound up in the question, what is the arche of what exists? So here we have an answer from Thales, who again is considered the earliest Greek philosopher, and he identifies the arche with water, the natural element of water. And what we have here is some really interesting reasoning behind it. So notice that, one of the things that makes it so interesting to study these early philosophers is that they had very little in the way of resources for explaining the world around them. So they had lots of questions about the world, lots of questions about themselves, but unlike us, they didn't have scientific developments, they didn't have science as a discipline, and very importantly, they didn't have the kinds of technology now that we have today to investigate these questions in scientific ways. What they had was basically just, their eyes and ears and their senses, and they could observe the world around them. And so what we are seeing here with these early philosophers is them looking around the world and just using their minds and thinking and saying, look, based on what I can see in the world around me, how can I use that information to try to explain these bigger questions that I have about the world? And so on the one hand, some of their answers seem really simplistic and even sort of silly from our perspective. But I think it's really important and cool to keep in mind just how little they were working with. And I think the answers that they come up with in a lot of cases are actually really impressive in light of that fact. But so here we have some interesting reasons that are given for his belief that the arche is water. So he observes that everything derives its nourishment from what is moist, and water is the source of growth for moist things. So one of the obvious things about organic things, about living things, is that we need water and moisture to survive. Water is something that if we don't have, we can survive for a very small amount of time. Water makes plants grow. Animals, humans all have to drink water, drink fluids constantly in our lives, or we die. And so that suggests that, the principle of life, what keeps life going and gives it its source, is this water that we constantly have to replenish ourselves with in order to grow and in order to continue living. So that's one of the reasons he gives. And then also, and from the fact that the seeds of all things have a moist nature. So here he has in mind both the idea of like literal seeds that grow into plants in nature, which have a moistness to them. But he's also in particular thinking about semen, animal and human semen, and the idea that, so of course, the Greeks were aware that a key part of the reproductive process involved semen. And seemingly, what's happening is from a small bit of the moisture that is semen ultimately grows like whole animals and whole human beings. And you can imagine how sort of miraculous and magical, in a way, that seemed to them. And so Thales is reasoning that, okay, if a little bit of seed or semen can grow into the complex, living, existing things that we are and that we see in the world around us, why not think that moisture itself could have been the source of the whole universe? So it's a really sort of interesting way of reasoning about this. And again, one that I think becomes more compelling and interesting the more we try to get inside the mindset of the resources he was working with. I won't talk as much about Heraclitus's view, but Heraclitus, unlike Thales, who thought everything was water or came from water in some way, Heraclitus identified the arche with fire. So here we have another case of an early philosopher sort of using a natural element in the world, fire, and identifying that as being somehow the source of, or the thing that, the source of the universe, or what the universe is made of, or what keeps it moving and going and existing in some important way. Anaximenes had another view, like the previous two, but he identified the arche, or the principle of all things, with air. He writes, "It differs in its essence according to its rarity or density. When it is thinned, it becomes fire, while when it is condensed, it becomes wind, then cloud. When still more condensed, water, then earth, then stones. Everything else comes from these." So what Anaximenes is thinking is that air is sort of the starting point of all things. It's what everything is made of. And when you condense air a little bit more, it turns into clouds. And when you compress the clouds more, they become water. And if you compress it even more, it can become earth, and ultimately the hardest thing, the hardest kind of earth, stone. So again, he's reasoning from everyday phenomena. So we know the phenomenon most obviously of condensation. We see air condensing into water. We see an airy substance, which are the clouds, producing water in the form of rain. So he's reasoning that air is the underlying nature of all things, and everything is air, just in various levels of density. Empedocles also identified the sort of source of the universe and the nature of the universe with natural elements. But unlike the previous thinkers that we were just looking at, he identifies it with a mix of four main elements: fire, air, water, and earth. And he says that they're everlasting but changing in their multitude and fewness by combination or separation. So the idea here is that there's four basic principles of the world, these four elements. And everything that exists is some sort of combination in different levels of mixture, different proportions, different arrangements, but somehow different combinations of these things. And things come into existence and out of existence through the combinations or the separations of the various elements. So one way of understanding this in relation to the previous views is, whereas somebody like Anaximenes recognized that, of course, water and earth exist, he thought that they were the same kind of thing as air. They all just were air when it's compressed at different levels. Empedocles, by contrast, thought that fire, air, water, and earth were completely separate things that couldn't be reduced to one another. They were discrete things existing separately and apart in nature, but they could be combined with one another. So instead of just one underlying element that can transform into the others, we have four fundamental elements. Okay, so now let's look a little bit at the early Greek philosophers' views on the nature of psychology. First, what are we talking about when we talk about early Greek conceptions of psychology? So for the early Greeks, the main word for the soul was psyche. We saw that this word was used in Homer, and it becomes sort of the main term for referring to the soul in later philosophers. For the Greeks, the soul, or psyche, is what distinguishes living things from non-living things. So early Greek philosophers, or early Greeks in general, notice that there's, they look around the world and that they notice that there's a difference between things that are alive and things that are not alive. And whatever that difference is between them is what they're trying to explain. So another way of putting this is the soul is whatever it is that makes some things living and some things not living. And that's the sort of fundamental question that they want to understand. For early philosophers, there were a couple main defining features of the soul or psyche. So first of all, motion. They noticed that things that are alive have the capacity to move of their own volition, or by their own by processes that are inherent within them. So for example, a person or animal, of course, can move around in accordance with our desires. We can make ourselves move when we want to. A rock just sort of stands still until a force acts against it, until it's thrown or dropped or whatever. The other thing that distinguishes living things from non-living things, and thus is a defining feature of soul for the early philosophers, were cognitive capacities. So in particular, sense perception, and in the case of rational animals like human beings, thought itself. So in other words, one of the things that defines living things is that they are aware of the world around them. They perceive the world around them through sensory processes, and in the case of human beings, are capable of thinking and reflecting on the world around them and thinking about things in general. So these are the two main features that soul has for the early philosophers. And one of the recurring themes of their views about what the soul is, what that special thing is that makes us alive, is that it was similar to the cosmos itself. So in early philosophy, the debate over what the soul is like, what its nature is, paralleled the debate about the nature of the cosmos and what it's made of. So what we'll find is that many philosophers thought that the soul was composed of the same element or elements that they identified as the arche of the natural world generally. Again, let's look at some examples. So various early philosophers proposed a lot of different accounts of what the soul or psyche is: water, air, fire or fiery atoms, earth and fire as a combination, blood, or a harmony of some kind. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I will give a few specific examples here. Okay, so Thales said the principle was water, being led to this view by considering what is evident to the senses. For in fact, the hot lives off the moist, and dead bodies dry out, and the seeds of all things are moist, and every kind of nourishment is juicy. So again, we saw that Thales was really interested in the power of moisture and fluid to be a source of life. And another thing that he notices that we see here is that dead bodies dry out. So the point here is one of the things that happens after bodily death, after we die, is that our bodies dry out and decompose and eventually become skeletons. So what happens is that as soon as we stop being alive, we start being drier and drier and drier. And so Thales, this was another reason for him to think that, okay, what the soul is, what it is that makes us alive, is a special kind of moisture or water, just as it is moisture and water that we need to constantly consume and take in order to stay alive. So his answer was that the soul is a kind of water, and again, he thought the cosmos as a whole was also a kind of water, or in some way came from water. Heraclitus, who, as we saw, thought of the universe as being a form of fire, or importantly, sort of derived from fire, thought that the soul is a very kind of special, pure kind of light or spark or fiery substance. So again, we have a case where he identifies the nature of the soul as being the same in kind as the nature of the cosmos as a whole. One more thing about this. So again, the reasoning here is really interesting. So again, one of the things that what we're trying to explain is what distinguishes the living from the non-living. And so another thing that sort of is a noticeable difference that occurs after we die is that our bodies become cold. So that suggests to somebody like Heraclitus that heat or fire is the source of life itself. Heat is what distinguishes the living from the non-living, and that's why when we die, our bodies become cold. So Democritus had a similar view to Heraclitus in that he identified the soul with fire, but Democritus was an atomist, so he thought that the world was made of atoms of all different kinds and all different shapes and sizes. And for him, the soul in particular was made of the same kind of atoms as fire. He says, "For it has the finest parts and is the most incorporeal of the elements, and moreover, it is moved by and moves the others in a primary way." He thinks they're spherical because the sphere is the most mobile of the figures, and mind and fire have this character. Okay, so what's going on here is that Democritus is noticing something about the nature of thought and perception, which is it happens very quick. So think about just the fact that, like, as soon as we touch something, we're aware of the sensation of touching it. We can feel things as soon as they affect our bodies. We don't perceive a lag time between touching something and being able to feel it. And so that means that perception is something that is transmitted really, really fast, which suggests that our souls must be something that is very fast moving. So he says, well, if the world is made of atoms, what kind of atom would the soul need to be in order to explain that kind of quickness? And he notices that spheres are sort of the most mobile shape that there is. So there's a reason why, for example, wheels are round. Excuse me. Circles and spheres are very conducive to motion. If you throw a bunch of marbles, on a cement surface, for example, they will scatter and move very quickly. Whereas if you throw, a handful of rocks, they will kind of not move very far and will move not as quickly. So he thinks that the soul is a very kind of special, spherical, very finely shaped and mobile kind of atom. And he thinks that fire is made of the same kinds of atoms because fire is something that is constantly in motion. And it's also a very fine substance in the sense that you can't reach out and grab fire, yet it is nonetheless a very powerful substance. So here is a view of Empedocles, who believes that since the heart is nourished in pools of pulsing blood, there in particular is where thought is said to be, said by men to be, for blood surrounding the heart is human thought. So we've already seen that the Greeks tended to, or many Greeks thought that the soul or mind is closely associated with the heart. And Empedocles was a early philosopher who really sort of ran with that idea and identified the soul with our blood itself. And here again, the idea is, look at the difference between living and non-living things. Living things have a beating heart, or at least animals have a beating heart and blood running through their veins. If we lose too much blood, we die. So Empedocles thinks, okay, so blood is the key thing that distinguishes the living from the non-living. That's what the soul is, and that's where thought and perception take place. Okay, turning now to a little bit more of biology and psychology. So many early philosophers viewed biology and psychology in terms of the mixture of natural elements or qualities. One of the pairings, or a couple of the pairings that were especially important, were the oppositions of hot versus cold and wet versus dry. We'll see this come up again and developed in much more sort of sophisticated detail when we turn to the Hippocratic School of Medicine. But we also see evidence of it in these early views. When it comes to biology and psychology, the early philosophers used their philosophies to offer explanations or accounts of a wide range of phenomena that relate to sort of the biological and the psychological. So one example is the differences between male and female animals. One of the things that early philosophers wanted to explain was why some animals are born biologically male and others are born biologically female. And so they had theories that they used to explain that. For example, a lot of early philosophers believed that female animals are essentially colder than male animals, and male animals are essentially warmer. And so the reason why some babies are born female versus male is that in the embryo they are colder than if they were born male. They also explained physiological phenomena like sleep, aging, the nature of health and disease, and death itself. And they explained physiological and biological processes like respiration, circulation, and cognition. Now, I'm not going to go through their views on the details of all of these things. That sort of goes beyond what we need for the purposes of this course. But I am going to talk briefly about a few of their theories of health and disease, and then I'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of their explanations of sense perception and thought. When it comes to the nature of health and disease, we find a few different proposed accounts of or explanations of what causes disease in the early philosophers. So one theory is that it's due to heaviness and lack of air in the blood. So that was the view of Diogenes. Recall that Diogenes is the philosopher who thinks that the universe is air. And so air has this sort of special function in the natural world in general. And he thinks that it has a special function when it comes to biology and human life as well. The best kind of air is sort of pure light air. And so if the air in our bodies becomes too heavy and less pure, that causes disease and disruptions in bodily processes. The philosopher Philolaus thought that disease was due to irregularities in bile, blood, and phlegm due to either excess heat, so we become too hot, our bodies become too hot, excess cold, or improper nutrition. And we'll see, again, issues of related to or explanations that invoke bile, blood, and phlegm. We'll see that come up again in the Hippocratics, but in a much more sort of developed form. And finally, we have the view of Alcmaeon. So Alcmaeon says that what maintains health is the equality of the powers, of the moist, the dry, cold and hot, bitter and sweet, and the others, while the domination of one of the two in a pair of opposites is destructive for the other. And sickness occurs with regard to the agent from excess of heat or cold. So this is a really good example of the way that a lot of early thinkers, Greek philosophers, thought of the nature of biology and psychology and health and disease in terms of the way that various elements and qualities are balanced or not balanced within us. So he is focused in particular on certain kinds of opposite qualities. And the idea is that our bodies need to be, have the right balance of moisture versus dryness, coldness versus hotness, and various other qualities. And when those get disrupted or out of balance, and one quality dominates too much over the other, that's when we're sick. And one of the things that is informing this kind of reasoning are some basic observations about health and disease. So one of the things that happens when we get sick sometimes is that we get a fever. So our body becomes too hot, and that is associated with disease. We also often, when we're sick, feel chills, which is too cold. When we are sick, we often have a lot of congestion and phlegm. So that's our bodies becoming too moist, where moisture is dominating dryness, and we don't have the sort of proper balance of these elements. So that's another way of understanding health and disease that we find in these early thinkers. Okay, so this is really interesting. We're going to look at a few theories of sense perception and thought. And I love talking about this subject because this is a case where we have early Greek philosophers, and this was one of the things they all sort of are really interested in, trying to understand the processes of cognition. How is it that we as human beings comprehend the world around us, are aware of the world around us, perceive the world around us? How do we learn new things? How do we think? What is going on when all of that is happening? It's this really fascinating question, and they're trying to apply the resources of their sort of of the natural explanations that they make use of, and use those to inform their answers to these questions. One of the defining issues among early Greek philosophers when it comes to cognition is controversy over the question of whether like is known by like. So to understand what this controversy is about, let's start with this point. Cognitive processes, that is, sense perception and thinking, or knowing, involve two main components in the process. There's the thing known or perceived, which is the object of perception, and then there's the knower or perceiver, which is the subject of the possession of the perception. So, for example, when we perceive a tree, we are the subject that's performing the act of cognition. We're the subject that is doing the perceiving. And the tree is the object of cognition, the object of perception. It's the thing out there in the world that we are perceiving. And then the mental act of cognition, our perception of the tree, is the process by which we, as the subject, perceive or are aware of the object. Cognition isn't purely about sense perception, though. We can also have cognition of imperceptible things or abstract truths. So, for example, take the case of a mathematical truth. In this case, the fact that 2 + 2 = 4 is a truth, a mathematical truth that we can know. It's the object of cognition or the object of knowledge. And when we learn that, we are the subject of knowledge, the subject of that cognition. And then the mental act of knowing it or cognizing it is what happens inside our head when we, the subject, come to know the object of cognition. Okay, so we've defined the subject and the object of cognition. The controversy over whether like is known by like ultimately is the question of whether the subject and the object of cognition must be similar or different from one another. Okay, so let's get more into that by talking about some specific views, and we'll start with Diogenes. So Diogenes is a proponent of the idea that like is known by like. That is, that the subject of cognition is similar to or the same kind of thing as the object of cognition. So, as we've seen for Diogenes, the composition of the universe is air. That's what everything is made of. And he also thinks that the soul itself is a kind of air or an airy substance. So, whenever our soul, which is a type of air, is perceiving the world, that's a case of something that is itself air perceiving something else that is itself air. So that's a case of like being known by like. Now, why is this? I think the language like is known by like is sort of, at least to my ear, sort of a strange sounding thing. Why was this a controversy? Why were people drawn to the idea that like is known by like? I think that it helps maybe to think about sort of the idea of sympathetic understanding. So if I want to understand you or know something about the kinds of experiences that you've had or that you're having, it will help if I have myself had similar experiences. So the more that I'm similar to you or like you, the better that I will be able to understand you and sort of know what your experiences are like. In a way, the Greeks are taking that sort of basic insight and applying it on a larger scale. So the idea is that if the soul is made of, in this case, air, then it will be better positioned to make contact with and understand and, so to speak, sympathize with the world around it and to know the world around it. Something else that's an important feature of Diogenes's view is that thinking requires a special kind of pure, hot, dry air. So to go back to this slide, air has lots of different forms and qualities. We've seen that it can compress and become water and other things. It can take on lots of different qualities. And that explains why there's vast differences among things in the world, living versus non-living, and also a lot of differences among specific living things, and individual people vary from person to person. That's because air can take on such diverse forms. So the special kind of air of its many forms that is required for thought is pure, hot, dry air. Second, air is pure, hotter, and drier the higher off the ground it is. Now, these two facts Diogenes uses in his theory to explain a lot of different sort of observable phenomena. So first of all, the effects of alcohol on thought. So the idea is that alcohol is a kind of moisture that weighs down or impairs the air inside of our bodies, the air that constitutes our souls, and that impairs our ability to think. That's why we don't think as clearly when we are intoxicated. We've also seen above that he thinks of disease as involving kind of heavy, impure kinds of airs coming into the blood. Another example is the lack of thought in in non-human animals. So by this, he has in mind, in particular, the lack of rational thought. So so here's my dog Lola, who likes to hang out on my desk while I'm working. So why is Lola not as rational and intelligent as a human being? Why can't dogs, think and reason and talk and do math the way that human beings can? And why can't non-human animals in general not do things like engage in sophisticated reasoning and mathematics and that sort of thing? His answer is that it's because they're too close to the ground. So she's on all fours, she's down on the ground, and so she's breathing air that is less pure and hot and dry, the air that's required for thinking. So because animals are on all fours and closer to the ground, their souls are not sort of replenished by and not getting access to consistently the kind of air that is necessary for reasoning. So that's why she's not very smart. Like, she goes outside and she's 9 years old, but somehow has not learned that eating grass will make her sick. It's because she's so little and so small and close to the ground. Another example is the irrationality of children. So why can children not engage in the same kinds of rational processes that adults can? So they start off not being able to even engage in speech. And then there's a lot for them to learn. They can't do math yet. They can't do a lot of the more sophisticated applications of our reasoning that most adult human beings can do. Again, it's because they're small. They're close to the ground, so their souls are not getting replenished by the right kind of air. And finally, the lack of cognition in all plants. So why can't plants think and reason? Well, it's because they too are literally rooted in the ground, and their roots are where they're sort of taking in nourishment, and they're not getting the right kind of, or at least this is how Diogenes is thinking of them. They're not getting the right kind of air and nourishment that will facilitate reasoning and perception. Okay, let's move on to another thinker's theory of cognition, Empedocles. So Empedocles shares the view that like is known by like. So he agrees with Diogenes on this point. He thinks that the world is a mix of the four elements. We've seen that. He thinks that thinking or perception occurs in the soul, which is the blood. We've also seen that. And here's the crucial point. He thinks that blood is an especially well-blended mix of the four elements. So inside the blood, he thinks, we have earth, water, air, and fire. They're all sort of blended together in this especially powerful mixture that is conducive to thinking and perception. So the world around us is made of these four elements, and then our blood is an especially well-blended mix of those four elements. And because of that, our blood or soul enables us to understand the world around us. Empedocles also advocated what's known as a pore effluence theory of perception. So he thought that objects of each sense fit the pores of that particular sense. What does he mean by that? So he thinks that each of our sensory organs has tiny pores that are different sizes and shapes. So our ears have certain sizes and shapes of pores, our tongues have certain sizes and shapes of pores, our eyes, and so on. And so when we see something, it's because the sensory object, what we're perceiving, can fit the pores of that particular sense. So he thinks that objects in the outside world all emit constant effluences. So an effluence is literally a flowing away. So he thinks that everything in the world, everything perceptible in the world, is constantly sort of radiating these effluences off of itself, and these effluences communicate sensory data. But the effluences that they emit aren't suited to fit every pore in all of our sense organs. So when we hear something, it's because the effluence that is entering our ear is just right to fit into that kind of pore. When we taste something, it's because the effluence is just right to fit into the pores on our tongue. When we see something, it's because the effluence has the right shape to fit into those pores. And so this explains why one sense isn't able to perceive the objects of another sense. We don't taste how things look, for example. We don't hear how things smell. So each sensory organ has its own unique type of sensory quality that it is well suited to perceive, and it's well suited to perceive them because of the size and shapes of the pores that it has and how those are fitted to the effluences coming from the external objects. Empedocles also explains individual human traits that we have based on the way the elements are blended together in the blood. So remember, all four elements are sort of blended together in this special mixture, but the mixture does have minor variations. If it's perfectly balanced, then we'll be especially intelligent. If the mixture becomes too dilute, too rarefied, that makes people slow and stupid, he thinks. By contrast, if the mixture is excessively dense, it makes people rash and impetuous. So the idea here is that we have these elements in our blood. And when things are packed together tightly, especially dense, then motion takes place really quickly. So motion can be transmitted from one thing to another immediately because they're so close together. And so when motion can be transmitted really quickly, that means that we can act on our thoughts really, really quickly, and sometimes potentially too quickly, which makes us rash. By contrast, if the elements in our blood are too far apart from one another, then when we decide to do something or want to think, motion or contact, the motion that is involved in thought, takes place slowly because the elements have farther to travel to make contact with one another. So here we have a case where he's trying to explain specific aspects of personality and like qualities that individuals have in terms of specific mixtures of elements in the blood. And the final person we'll look at today is Anaxagoras and his view on cognition. So Anaxagoras represents the opposite side in this controversy. For him, like is not known by like. And he thinks this because we see color. So here's one of his arguments. We see color with the pupil, which itself lacks color. So our pupils are black, and the Greeks understood that it played a special role in the process of sight. And so by this thing on us, which is black, which lacks color, we are able to perceive all the colors in the outside world. So it is with something which is colorless that we perceive the colorful. And when there's no light and no colors in the world around us, we can no longer see because there's no longer dissimilarity. The outside world, when it becomes black in the absence of light, is too much like our black pupil, and so vision can't take place anymore. Another one of the reasons he thought this is because a lot of qualities can only be perceived when they make contact with their opposites. So, for example, if we get into a hot tub, we notice the heat right away because the temperature of the hot tub is different from the temperature of our bodies. As we sit in the hot tub for a while and it heats our bodies become more similar to the temperature of the hot tub, and we no longer perceive its heat as saliently. So for these sorts of reasons, Anaxagoras thought that like is not known by like, rather we can only know things that are dissimilar from us. He also thought that there was a close connection between sense perception and pain. So for him, pain is something that occurs when sentient beings make contact with something that is dissimilar or different from them or unlike them. So, since all perception involves us perceiving the dissimilar or perceiving what is unlike us, that means that all perception for Anaxagoras is painful to some degree. Now, usually, that's counterintuitive because generally we don't think of ourselves as experiencing pain when we perceive the world around us. But his explanation of that is that the pain is just usually so slight that it's unnoticeable. But it is evident in extreme cases. So for example, when we look at if we look directly at the sun, that is an uncomfortable experience for our eyes because it's so bright, so different from our pupils that we actually do feel the discomfort. Similarly, if we make contact with something that is too hot, it burns us. So there we have another extreme case where we actually do feel pain. Another example would be when we taste something that is extremely spicy or extremely, say, sour. That can also be experienced as a kind of pain or discomfort or unpleasant experience. So for all of those reasons, he thinks that perception is a kind of pain, and both of them involve making contact with something that is unlike us. Okay, so that was a lot of information to take in, a lot of details in these theories. I suggest that you review this PowerPoint again to sort of like make sure that you understand everything. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to me or post them on the discussion board. Otherwise, I will talk to you all next week.